It looks like we are live. Let me just double check, make sure that all the audio and such is working. It looks like we are live. Let me just double check, make sure that all the audio and such is working. Okay, it looks like it's working. It's been a while since I've done this. I want to make sure I was doing it right, and I've changed things around a bit. I'm using OBS here to make this fun little frame here. It also cuts off part of my office here that's still a little haphazard. Eventually I'll set it up to be a little more fancy. While I'm waiting to see if a few people join in, my name is Brian Almon. I write at gemstate.substack.com. I invite you to go there and check it out. Subscribe today. Free subscribers get about 2 to 3 or sometimes 4 to 5 posts a week. Paid subscribers get to support me so I can do this full time, but also I try to do some extras for them. Posts every single day, early access to things. If you're a paid subscriber, you got access to my podcast last Monday about the 5 different American republics we've experienced as a nation, and free subscribers had it unlocked this morning. So that is that. Got my green tea here, just a little bit of something for the afternoon. Gemstate.substack.com. So yeah, with all that's going on in the world, especially in the Middle East, it seems like there's always something going on in the Middle East. And for some reason, for various reasons, that region of the world holds an outsized importance for a lot of Americans. And so what happens there is, affects things here, if only in how it draws battle lines between various political factions in America. So I wanted to go over the history of that region. History is my favorite subject. It's something I enjoy reading and learning about, and I think it's important to learn history because it gives you a perspective about what is happening now. Things didn't just start, yesterday. History did not begin in 2016 or 1984 or 1776 or whatever. Everything that's happened today, everything that's happening right now, has a predecessor, has something that happened in the past that set up the situation that we now face today. The 20th century is a great example of that. A lot of things led to World War I, a lot of things, and that conflagration then led to many other things, led indirectly to the Great Depression, led directly to World War II. And World War II, of course, led to the Cold War and nuclear weapons and, things that we're still facing today. So it's important to look back at history to see what happened then, so we understand why things are happening now. And also, so we can get some historical context and we can see how things happened in the past. I think one of the worst things about American discourse now is a lack of historical context, which allows... It creates the situation where people can be manipulated by politicians and bad faith actors. I remember all the way back 20 years ago in the presidential election where John Kerry was saying this is the worst economy since the Great Depression. Or consider the fallout from January 6th, how they're calling it the worst thing to happen since Pearl Harbor or even the Civil War. It's because the people doing this, they know that voters, most people don't read much history, so they remember a few events. They remember the Civil War or Pearl Harbor or the Great Depression from their high school civics classes or history classes. And so those are, triggering words to trigger certain emotions that they can then use. But when you read history, you see the way things actually happened. You can see whether or not a current event is an outlier or if it's another thing that happens. There are depressions, there are recessions. It happens pretty regularly. But people have a short memory, so they forget. And then politicians and bad faith actors are able to use that short memory against us. So the reaction to the events in Israel, there seem to be 4 main groups of varying sizes. 2 on the right, 2 on the left. I'll start with the left. On the far left, the fringes, the younger groups, the groups that are more representative of immigrant populations, are very anti-Israel. They are pro-Hamas. They are outright pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, and they support what happened, and they kind of want it to happen here, and that's scary. And I'll cover them a little more later in the stream. I've got some notes here and some pictures. But that's the far left. The center left, the moderate left, the older generations of the left, of the Democratic Party, are actually pro-Israel, which you might not know if you just watch, Fox News or have only read conservative media for the last 20 years. Obama was kind of tepid on Israel, but most other American presidents were fairly pro-Israel. And, that makes sense. A lot of the leadership of the Democratic Party, the older generations, are Jewish, and so they're going to have an affinity for Israel. And then on the right, you have, the middle right, or the most of the right is also pro-Israel. You have, the neoconservatives who just want war. For some reason we need to go to war with Iran, according to Lindsey Graham now. And then you have a lot of, obviously, the evangelicals who have a very special connection to Israel because of beliefs about, dispensationalism and the end times and other biblical concepts. And I'll go into that a little more later. I mean, I think a lot of my audience probably falls into that, so I don't want to preach to the choir too much. And then you have a very small group on the right who are fairly anti-Israel for various reasons. Some of them just, especially younger generations. Again, this is the younger generations on the fringes here, react against the very pro-Israel stance of the majority of the Republican Party, and being contrarian, they want to find another position. There's also, folks who say, well, what about Palestinian Christians? Why do we support, Israelis, but, when they're, expanding into these lands owned, formerly owned by Arab Christians? And, that's a legitimate concern. And then there's also folks who just, for whatever reason, they are not fond of Jewish people. And this is the far right now. And that reflects in their attitude toward this conflict as well. And it's kind of frustrating because these groups always talk past each other. You'll see one group of people sharing pictures, of alleged Hamas atrocities. And we have no idea if they're true or not, but if you question it, well, then you're a Hamas supporter. But then you have the other side, they're sharing pictures of alleged Israeli atrocities. And if you question whether or not it's actually true, you are labeled, a supporter of what they call an apartheid state, or a bully country. So it's really hard to have a dialogue about this because everybody has such a strong emotional reaction to it. So that said, I'm going to try and wade into it and have a conversation. And I have my own biases. I grew up in an evangelical community that was very pro-Israel, and I'm still fairly pro-Israel. I don't hold to some of the dispensationalist eschatological arguments that I once believed as a teenager, but generally I see Israel as as a more civilized society in the midst of nations that are not so civilized. The Palestinian Arabs, their cartoons that their children grow up watching tell them to kill Israelis. So, how do you coexist with something like that? But on the other hand, I think some of the calls for essentially genociding the Palestinians are not good either. Anyway, let's see. Let's switch over to this map. Excuse me. So this is where we start. I mean, you could start even further back. You go back to the biblical history of the people of Israel. They were, a nomadic tribe in the ancient Near East. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the patriarchs, they had huge flocks of lamb, sheep and goats and camels and I don't know, whatever else they had. And that was not abnormal for this people group in the ancient Near East at the time. And of course they settled in Egypt because of a famine, eventually became slaves in Egypt. Moses led them out of Egypt to the promised land where, God had promised Abraham years before, and they eventually slowly conquered it through the period of the Judges, and then eventually under King Saul, King David. And by King David, King Solomon, it reaches its furthest extent. Israel is actually, at this point, a power. squeezed between several other powers. You had the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and Israel's kind of the spot right in the middle of those two empires. So they're always getting crushed one side or the other. But for this period, they're independent. They are a power in the world, and of course Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not always the capital for the Israelite people. It was only conquered during the reign of David. It was still controlled by a pagan Canaanite tribe up until that point. And the city itself has been around for countless millennia. It's one of those very old cities. Damascus up north in Syria is also a very, very old city. This is a very old place in the world. And that's because civilization developed here. Cities developed here. There are other places, India and China, where civilization also developed. But at this time, around 1000 BC, where my ancestors lived, in Germany and England and such, it was not civilized. That's not to say that they're bad people. It's just that they didn't really build much that still survives to this day. They didn't have a written language, so they didn't write things down for us to have today, whereas the people in the ancient Near East did. We have records from Egypt. We have records from Israel. We have records from Assyria. From Germany and England, we only have a few ruins, cave drawings. Stonehenge was around by then, and obviously that took a lot of skill to build. So, I'm not trying to denigrate my own ancestors here. I'm just saying that civilization developed at different rates at different parts of the world. Now, if you know the Bible, you know the story. Eventually, the kingdom split. Solomon's son, Solomon had used some harsh measures, even some slave labor, to build the temple and some of his big cities. And so when Solomon's son came to power, Rehoboam, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, he had a choice. Should he be the kinder, nicer king, or should he double down on his dad's harsh policies? And his elderly advisors, he went to two different groups of advisors. The elders said, no, you need to be nice. You need to show them, a gentle side so that they love you rather than fearing you. Whereas his contemporaries, the younger people who advised him, they said, nah, you need to go even harsher. That screwed up. A rebel leader arose, and the kingdoms were split. Rehoboam held on to the southern kingdom, which was basically the tribe of Judah, maybe the tribe of Benjamin as well. And the northern tribes became what we still called the kingdom of Israel. And they never again reached the height they did under David and Solomon. The kingdom of Israel was picked apart by the Assyrians, and the people were deported. This was a practice that the Assyrians did to make sure that their subject populations could not revolt. They didn't just leave their conquered peoples in their homelands. No, they took them, moved them throughout their empire, and then brought in others from their other subject peoples and moved them in to where they'd conquered. So they mixed people up. They broke up the tribes so that there couldn't be a strong enough power base to oppose them. And so the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were split up. They ceased to become a nation. Meanwhile, the southern kingdoms soldiered on for a few years and eventually was conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. And that's, of course, where, again, many people were taken from Jerusalem, from the southern kingdom, taken to Babylon and, made to live there. You can read about that in the books of Ezekiel, of Daniel, of Ezra, and Nehemiah. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus decided to let some of the conquered peoples go back home, and a lot of them did. Some of them didn't, because we then have the story of Esther, who was, still living in the Persian Empire rather than back in Jerusalem. But the ones that went back, they rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, rebuilt the walls, rebuilt the temple. Nehemiah oversaw the building of the temple, and it would later be expanded under King Herod. What's my next picture? I don't remember. Aha, Alexander the Great. Okay, so that's about the right time. The Persian Empire spread out and conquered most of the Middle East. But then Alexander, the king of Macedonia, comes in and conquers most of the known world, defeats the Persians, defeats the Egyptians, takes over everything. Now, by this time, Israel was not a power. It was a small group of Jewish people living in and around Jerusalem who were subject to the Persians, and now they're subject to the Greeks. Pardon me. Still got that tickle in my throat. I'm sure it'll go away sometime. Interesting. There's a city in Turkey named Granicus. That's the vendor that the city of Vigo uses and many other cities use for maintaining their agendas and meetings. That's interesting. I didn't know that. So Alexander conquers the known world, and in doing so, he spreads Greek philosophy, and that's really important. Now, Alexander's teacher, of course, had been Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, and he left Greek culture and Greek philosophy wherever he went. He gets all the way over to modern-day India, has trouble in Afghanistan, as most people do, and of course he dies. His empire is divided between his generals, and you have the Antiochids are ruling what used to be Israel. And that's where you have the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus IV, who was seemingly a bad guy. He's the guy who went to the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar. He's deliberately doing it to desecrate it and show that his gods are stronger than the Jewish God. But of course, the Maccabeans defeat him, drive him out, and for a brief time, Israel's independent again. They're not really a power because they're still squeezed between all these post-Alexandrian empires. The Ptolemies down in Egypt and the Antiochids up in Syria. And then eventually they fall to the Romans. And that's the Roman world around 117 AD. It's pretty close to the time of Christ, about 100 years off. Israel had been independent, but they were having a civil war. Two sides were fighting over the throne and the high priesthood. And the Roman general Pompey the Great, he called himself Pompey the Great, but he was pretty great. He was on an eastern campaign, conquering up pieces of the old Alexandrian empires. And he happens to be coming through Judea and finds these two sides at war. And one of the sides asks him for help, and he says, sure, I'll help you out. And of course, once he helps them out and defeats their opponents, Israel now becomes part of Rome. That's what you get for asking for help from Pompey and from the Romans. Other countries in the modern era should remember that. What do you get for asking for help from the United States? It's kind of the same idea. Whereas they had the Pax Romana, we had the Pax Americana. But that's fraying now, too. Hold on. So it was, of course, in this time that Christ is born in Bethlehem and has his ministry, death, burial, resurrection. That all happened in the Roman context. And it's interesting the point in history when this happened, because it allowed Christianity to spread, because the entire known world here was controlled by the Romans. You had the Pax Romana. It was fairly safe. Obviously, the apostles and the early church faced persecutions locally by Jewish religious leaders, but also eventually by the Romans themselves. Emperor Nero famously blamed Christians for the fire in Rome, which, well, considering that he had drawn up plans for a massive golden palace right where the fire took out a big chunk of houses, makes you wonder. In any case, he blamed the Christians, and that was the first great persecution, and there were others that followed. But at this time, the Jewish people still lived in Judea. However, that would change. In the year AD 70, the future Emperor Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, came in and put down the first Jewish revolt. And he laid siege to Jerusalem, broke through the walls, destroyed the temple. If you remember, Christ said that he weeps for Jerusalem and says that in a time in the future, not one stone of the temple will be standing on another, and that happened. This is one of the places where I've come to disagree with some of the premillennial dispensationalist eschatology. If you read something like Hal Lindsey, he wrote The Late Great Planet Earth back in the 70s, about how the rapture and the apocalypse and the tribulation were coming soon. He applies the prophecies of Matthew 24 the destruction of the temple, the how people need, when they see the armies coming from the north, they need to get to the hills, don't go into the city. He applies that to a future date, whereas I could see it being applied to the siege of Jerusalem by Titus. It fits. And if that's the case, then it changes the way you see the future. But I don't want to get into necessarily an eschatological discussion. A lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am hold various views on the subject. And you can go watch them instead. But what's interesting about it is how it changes things at the time. Once again, the temple's been destroyed, just like under Nebuchadnezzar, and that really changes Judaism. They no longer have the temple, which was the center of their religious life. And a lot of Jews at this time are converting to Christianity because they believe that Jesus was indeed the promised Messiah. And so that, puts the remaining Jews who do not believe, it changes their perspective. Now, this is kind of fun. I took this picture on my visit to Rome 12 years ago. This is from the Arch of Titus. Arches were created by Roman generals to show off their victories. It was a monument to their victory in a great war. And so this is Titus creating the Arch of Titus in Rome, celebrating his victory over the Jews in the first Jewish revolt. And building an arch, to celebrate that victory, it does show how the esteem that the Jews held, or that the Romans held the Jews. I mean, obviously they were grumpy that they had rebelled, but they saw them as a worthy adversary. You can see the menorah there from the temple being carried off. And what I found ironic last week, in the wake of the Hamas attack on Israel, the Arch of Titus itself was illuminated in blue and white, the colors of the Israeli flag. So 2,000 years after the Romans carried off the spoils of the temple and built a monument to their victory, now here they are illuminating that very monument in Israeli colors to show solidarity, which that just goes to show that things can change over 2,000 years. So a few hundred years go by. Obviously, I don't want to skip 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Simon Bar Kokhba raises up the remnant of the Jews in Jerusalem and launches what is actually the third Jewish revolt. There was another one in between. And this time the Romans were just done. They were tired of the Jews revolting. And so they not only put down the rebellion, but they initiated the diaspora. They drove the Jews out of Judea. And in fact, they renamed Judea to Palestine, after the ancient enemy of the Jews, the Philistines. They were just tired of them. They were tired of having to put down these revolts, so they emptied the land, and this was the beginning of a diaspora that would last from 135 all the way to 1948. So that's where, again, history illuminates current events. When Constantine became Christian, and then one of his successors made Christianity the official religion of the empire, the Middle East became a very Christian place. Christians built churches over the different spots where Jesus did things. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And so the culture of the Middle East became very Christian. But then, of course, you have the expansions of the Muslims in the 7th and 8th centuries. Not only do they take over Arabia, they take over much of the Middle East. They get all the way to the middle of France. Charles Martel defeats them in the 8th century, stopping their expansion into France. The Reconquista begins from the Kingdom of Asturias. That's that little... you can't see my cursor. That's the little piece of gray there in modern-day Spain. And that was all that was left of the Christian kingdoms of Spain that were left over. But from there, they started taking back Spain, and by 1492, they've completely expelled the Muslims from Iberia. And so what was once, what I hope you're getting here is that the Middle East has changed hands many times. This was once a Jewish area, is Israelite. That it was a Babylonian area, then a Persian area, then a Greek area, Roman, and then Christian, and now it's Arabic and Muslim. So that's a lot of different owners of this land. When people talk about who actually has the rights to live here, well, a lot of people do. You can make claims for the Jewish people to have a homeland here. You can make claims for Arabs and Muslims and Christians and descendants of the Byzantines. It's been one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the whole world. The Crusades were launched in response to the Muslim conquests. It wasn't immediate. Obviously, as you see, the Crusades took place in the 11th century, 12th century, whereas the Muslims had come in hundreds of years before. But what had happened is that rulers had started rising up in Jerusalem and the other cities who were starting to deny Christian pilgrims. A lot of the Christians of Europe thought it was fine, whether the Byzantines or the Muslims controlled the Holy Land, so long as they could still make their pilgrimages to Jerusalem and do the things they wanted. But rulers started coming up who started denying those pilgrims and attacking those pilgrims. Meanwhile, the Byzantines were getting pushed further and further back. They were once the inheritors of the entire Roman Empire, and now they're pushed back to basically the modern-day Balkans, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. And it was then that the emperor, Alexius Comnenus, wrote a letter to Pope Urban II just asking for a few troops. Can you send a few guys from Europe to help us out? The Turks are right on our doorstep. We've got some troubles. Help us out, will you? Well, Urban took it to the next level, and he preached the crusade. He asked that Europe's Christians, the knights, the lords, the kings, take the cross, which was literally taking a strip of red fabric and putting it on your shirt, your tunic, and pledge themselves to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. And of course, that was more than Emperor Alexios had bargained for, and he soon found that the Crusaders were almost as troublesome as the Muslims themselves. In fact, in the Fourth Crusade, at the urging of Doge Enrico D'Angelo of Venice, the Crusaders actually sacked Constantinople and instituted a Latin empire. And obviously that's not what the Byzantines bargained for. But the Crusades kind of became their own thing once they started. And this is the map you see here is the height of the Crusader kingdoms. They captured Jerusalem. They captured a lot of the areas around it, a lot of modern-day Israel. And so you had lords and kings who were European, French and German, English, Norman, who were ruling areas of the Holy Land. And of course, eventually the Muslims pushed them back. Saladin took Jerusalem. King Richard, the Lionheart of England, came back to try and take it back from him. He didn't succeed, but he fought him well enough that he forced him to agree to allow pilgrims to return, which was basically what they wanted in the first place. So, the Crusades were a long-lasting thing. It lasted hundreds of years, and it etched itself in the cultural memory of everybody. Now, Muslims today still point to the Crusades as, this is why we hate you. And, some Christians are still frustrated that, the Holy Land remains in the control of the Muslims. And at the same time, and this is something that I think is interesting, over the last 20, 30 years, our narrative here in America, which, remember, 20 or 30 years is very small on the, in the annals of history, when we're talking about centuries and millennia. But over the last 20 or 30 years, the narrative has been that the Muslims hate Christians and Jews. Whereas at the time of the Crusades, nobody would have said that. Because the Christian Crusaders, they saw both the Muslims and the Jews as unbelievers who need to be cleared out of the way. And so at the time, you had more instances of Muslims and Jews making common cause with each other to resist the Christian Crusaders. So that's another interesting thing to keep in mind, how alliances will shift depending on the circumstances. The way things are now, it's not always been that way throughout history. Things change. So the Crusader kingdoms are eventually all eliminated. One little off topic, though. The Normans were amazing. The Normans were the descendants of Vikings who conquered a chunk of France and were given that area of France, Normandy, Northman, by the king in exchange for them supporting him and keeping the other Vikings out. Those Normans, the descendants of several Norman families, not only took over that chunk of France, they eventually became the kings of England. They eventually became the kings of Italy, Sicily, and one of their descendants actually came on a Crusader kingdom and ran the Principality of Antioch for many years. So, I mean, that's really one family punching above their weight, which is pretty amazing. The Ottomans were the next great power to take over. The Arabs had just barely reconquered the Holy Land when they themselves were then conquered by the Ottoman Turks. Now, the Ottoman Turks are also Muslim. However, they are Turks, they are not Arabs. They are a different people group, different culture, different language, and it really chafed the Arabs that they were now ruled by a foreign power. The Arabs are the people of Muhammad, so they saw themselves as the most true Muslims. They were the people group that Muhammad came out of. They were the first Islamic peoples. They were the ones who controlled Mecca and Medina, the holy cities. And so being ruled by a foreign power, even if they're also Muslim, was very annoying to them, especially because the Sultan of the Ottomans eventually basically took the title of Caliph, the leader of the Muslim world. And that was very jarring too. Of course, the Ottomans took over Constantinople in 1453, ending the last vestiges of the Roman Empire. But the Sultan saw himself as the successor to the Romans, not a conqueror. He saw himself as the legitimate successor to the ancient Roman Empire. Everybody saw themselves that way. Some of the exiles from Constantinople eventually established the what became the Russian Empire and the Tsars, hence the word Tsar. The Russian word Tsar for their leader is literally a transliteration of Caesar. So the Russians too saw themselves as successors. The German word Kaiser, same thing. But the Ottomans, by their largest extent, right about here, 1683, they controlled a big chunk of the world, and they were knocking on the door of Western Europe. You see Vienna up there. I can zoom in. It was in the 16th century, the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslim, of course, were knocking on the door. They were sieging Vienna, and if Vienna fell, the capital of the ancient Austrians, then who knows how far they could get. But of course, Jan Sobieski comes in and saves the day with his winged hussars, and they are pushed back, just like Charles Martel did 800 years prior. So that was the extent of the expansion of the Ottomans. But this too changed the culture of the region. I mean, are you counting now? You had the Canaanite peoples, and then the Israelites, and then Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Roman Christians, Arab Muslims, and now you have Ottoman Turks ruling this area. It's, again, this one strip of land changes hands so many times throughout history. The Ottomans still rule this area going into the 20th century, which is hard to believe. The same Ottomans that defeated the Byzantines at Constantinople in 1453 were still ruling much of this area by the start of the 20th century, within the lifetimes of many people who are still alive today. Yeah, barely. Within the lifetimes of our fathers and grandfathers, at least. By World War I, the Ottoman Empire was in trouble. Half a century before, in the Crimean War, the Russians had actually come down to try and take Ottoman territory and had designs on retaking Constantinople, but Britain and France put aside their 1,000-year-old rivalry to unite with the Turks against the Russians. It's one of the first times you'll see, in a major way, Christian countries uniting with Muslim countries to fight another Christian country. The alliance defeats the Russians in there, so Constantinople remains Istanbul. And we go into World War One. Turks this time unite with Germany and Austria against Russia, France, and Britain. So here we go around the time of World War One. As you can see, I get my maps from various places. The Ottoman Empire is greatly reduced. The British have taken over Egypt by this time. And so they have a staging area here in Egypt. And when World War I breaks out and the Turks take the side of the Central Powers, of Germany and Austria, one of the ideas that the British has is to foment an Arab rebellion. Remember I said the Arabs have been chafing for hundreds of years now under Turkish rule. They would like to be independent. The problem is that the Arabs are not united. They are a very disparate group of tribes that normally would not get along unless they have a single enemy to fight, which the British are trying to say, look, you have a single enemy, so get together and fight them. And this is where, if you go back and watch Lawrence of Arabia, you'll really get that flavor. That's one of the themes of the movie, that Lawrence has to first convince these disunited tribes to fight against their common enemy, and then once the war is won, then they start fighting again, and that really disillusions him. But T.E. Lawrence, I'll show him there, the real guy. He was a very interesting guy. Really, studied Arabic and Islamic culture. And this is where we get to the seeds of the modern day conflict. Because during World War I, the British needed allies. They wanted Arab help to fight the Turks from within, but they also wanted the help of Jewish bankers and Zionists to help them fund the war. And so they made promises to both sides. To the Arabs, they said, help us out and you can have these lands as yours. To the Jewish people within Britain and Europe, they said, help us out and you can have this land to establish a Jewish state. Creating a Jewish state within Israel had been the goal of the Zionist movement for a while now. And so you have this famous letter written by Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, saying that, help, be on our side and we will promise you the creation of a Jewish state. It's the Balfour Declaration. So coming out of then World War I, where Britain has made promises to both sides over who gets to have this land, and it's a bit of a mess. And Britain and France are dividing up the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. Britain establishes puppet kings in a lot of these regions. And the regions that they decide are basically, there's hardly any rhyme or reason. You look at the modern boundaries of these countries on a map, and there's no real reason why they're drawn in the way they are. Why the borders between Iraq and Jordan and Syria are what they are. But they are. So that's what we have to deal with now. For whatever reason, they decide that the Kurds do not get to have a homeland, and so today the Kurds are split between Syria and Iraq and Turkey. The Hashemite kings are established over Iraq and Jordan and Syria. Eventually, they're overthrown in all of those except Jordan, and today's King Abdullah, he is actually descended from the same kings who helped out in World War I, who worked with Lawrence of Arabia, and he claims to be a direct descendant of Muhammad, which, good for him. Meanwhile, Egypt throws off their king. Gamal Abdel Nasser becomes the dictator after throwing off the British-backed king. In Iraq, the Ba'ath Party takes over, same thing in Syria. And so all these countries are going their separate ways after having been controlled by the British. Lebanon was controlled by the French. They're eventually kicked out. As of the 70s, there was kind of equal representation between Lebanese Christians and Lebanese Muslims, but there's a civil war. The Muslims basically win. However, Bashar al-Assad, even though he's vilified in the West, he's, Lebanese, Syrian, Christians consider him to be a more favorable guy than some of his enemies. And that's where it really gets into a mess. We go to Iraq to oust Saddam Hussein. And Saddam, for all his awfulness, and he was a bad guy, he kept a lid on ethnic and religious tension because they could all hate him equally, basically. So you have the Kurds, you have the Shia Muslims, you have the Sunni Muslims in Iraq, and he's on top of all of them. Once he's gone, well, then that changes the balance of power, and now basically the Shia Muslims in Iraq, who are allied with their co-religionists in Iran, are essentially running the show. Syria, you also have the remnants of the Ba'ath Party, and so when the Syrian rebellion breaks out, the Syrian civil war, we back his opponents, who are Sunni Muslims, there's a lot of, you make a Venn diagram between the Syrian rebels and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and there's some overlap there. And that's not good, because we're fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in one place while funding them in another place. It's become a huge mess. It really does date from the aftermath of World War I, where Britain promised everything to everyone. And in the middle of all this, you have Israel. For a while, Britain did not fulfill their promise to Lord Rothschild. Eventually, though, after World War II, with much more sympathy toward the Jewish people because of the atrocities of Hitler and all that went along with that, there was a lot more political capital to create the Jewish state. David Ben-Gurion declares the creation of Israel, and the Arabs had been offered a compromise. Okay, we'll give Israel this chunk of land. Basically, it doesn't include the West Bank or the Gaza Strip or the Golan Heights, which they control today. But we'll give them this. The Arabs can have the rest. The Arab nations reject it and immediately invade Israel. Israel cleans their clocks because the Arabs were not very powerful at that point. It really is a quirk of history that this region of the world became so important, basically because of oil. In the aftermath of World War I, they're trying to divide it up, but it could well have become just like colonies in Africa. Okay, it's a trouble spot in the world, but it's not that it really doesn't matter. Whereas once they discovered oil, suddenly every one of these countries becomes super important for the world economy and for world militaries. I didn't include it in my deck here, but there's a great picture of President Eisenhower meeting, I believe it's King Abdulaziz, the founder of Saudi Arabia. And you're wondering how these, tribesmen who, at the time of Lords of Arabia, for example, they're disunited tribes, and you're just trying to get them to help you go defeat the Turks. And then by the time of President Eisenhower, just 30, 40 years later, suddenly they have the power to change the balance of power in the entire world. And that's really what it becomes. Both the U.S. and Russia during the Cold War, we start getting involved. The United States is allied with Israel and tepidly with Saudi Arabia, whereas Russia comes in, they're allied with Iran, they're allied with Syria, they ally with Egypt when it was controlled by Nasser. And so Israel wins the first war there, and then in 1967 you have the Six-Day War. Once again, the Arab states try to invade. It's Egypt and Syria and Jordan invade. Israel cleans their clocks too and claims the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank. Every time they invade, Israel gets more land, which you kind of need for negotiating purposes later. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, 50 years ago this month. Egypt and Syria invade. By now, Jordan, I think, has had enough, although I think they still support the invasion, just not with, they don't do it on their own. And Israel finds it a little harder this time. And this conflict threatens to start World War III. Both Richard Nixon of the U.S. and Leonid Brezhnev of Russia are involved, with their respective allies, trying to keep them from escalating things further, trying to establish a ceasefire, and finally they agree to a ceasefire, and they start negotiations over that, and those negotiations end in the Camp David Accords, where President Carter brings Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel to Camp David. They work out a deal. Israel gives back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and in return, Egypt says Israel's a real country. We're going to recognize, that you have a right to exist, which was progress. Up until then, none of the Arab countries had done that. They had adopted this idea that there could be no negotiation because Israel was illegitimate and we're just going to get rid of them. But this was good. Peace is good. And that's something I think we, especially in the years in the mid-2000s where the neoconservatives were ascendant and were invading Iraq and Afghanistan and thinking about invading Iran, people had got this idea that war is good, conquest is good. These are people who need to be wiped off the map. But, I mean, in the words of the great philosopher Rodney King, why can't we all just get along? So that's basically where we get to today. You have the Palestinian people. They're, if you go to a pro-Palestinian source, they'll say that Palestine existed before 1948 and that Israel has slowly taken over it. But that's not entirely true. Before 1948, there was no real nation there. Before World War I, it was all controlled by the Ottomans, and there were Arabs living everywhere, a few Jews, a few Christians. Unfortunately, one thing people don't know is that one of the side effects of our invasion of Iraq was essentially the eradication of Iraq's Christian community. Saddam, again, for all his faults, he didn't go on a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Christians who lived in Iraq, who had been living there for 2,000 years. But once he was out of the way, the more hardline Islamists, they did, and so Christians left, and it's a shame. But it's not something that American Christians really notice, because the only thing we know about in the Middle East is Israel, for various reasons. Anyway, so there never really was a Palestinian people. There were Arabs who happened to live here. Once Israel was established, a lot of them, rather than live under Israeli rule, they left to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But Egypt and Jordan didn't want them either. They have their own problems. They didn't want them there. Besides, they were useful tools. So long as there were Arabs, Palestinians, so to speak, living in refugee camps in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they were a tool that the other Arab states could use against Israel. They could say, look at these evil people. And they became breeding grounds for terrorism and for strife against Israel. And so, again, they were useful. The presence of Israel here became a unifying agent for the Arabs. Just like the British tried to get them to unite against the Turks, various Arab leaders were able to unify the Arab tribes by showing them that Israel was their real enemy. Even in 1991, Gulf War, Saddam Hussein launches Scud missiles at Israel because he wants Israel to respond. He's trying to bait them, because if Israel responded by invading Iraq, well, then maybe the other Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, would join with Saddam against the U.S. invasion to expel them from Kuwait. The United States told Israel to sit tight, don't respond, don't take the bait, and Israel sat tight, and none of the other Arab nations joined with Iraq. Saddam was isolated. The story of Saddam, by the way, shows, is a story that's all too common. We decided in the 1980s that Iran is the real enemy because Iran has been taken over by the extreme Shiite mullahs, the Ayatollahs, and they're very hostile to us, so we're hostile to them back because we, of course, had backed the Shah that they overthrew. And so we decide that Iran is the real enemy, so when Saddam comes to power in the 80s, we give him weapons and money to go fight Iran because he's invading Iran. Of course, once, that means he thinks we're on his side. So when he invades Kuwait, he figures that we'd be good with that. We were not. And so we depose him. It's a lesson. You take money and weapons from America, and you might be next on the chopping block. It's a mess, and I wish we weren't involved at all, but we were. In fact, it's the aftermath of the Gulf War where we kept soldiers and military bases in Saudi Arabia. That was at least the claimed reason that Osama bin Laden launched terror attacks against us. Not necessarily giving him all the credence, but that was his public reason, and that's why he was able to attract people to Al-Qaeda's banner. And again, it's just a mess. And it's frustrating that we are involved and that we will continue to be involved. A lot of people don't know that it was actually Jimmy Carter who really started our involvement in Middle Eastern geopolitics and war. After, I don't remember if it was before or after the Camp David Accords, but he established what you can look up as the Carter Doctrine, that any attack on our allies or our interests in the Persian Gulf will be seen as an attack on America. And so, we kind of weasel our way in there, and now we're there. And now how do we extricate ourselves? So that's where we are here. The Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, they over the last 2 weeks, pro Arab Muslim people or pro Arab Christian or anti-Israeli voices and rhetoric has called Gaza Strip an open air prison. And that ignores one big elephant in the room. You see the borders of the Gaza Strip here. It's the little gray dashes there. Most of the border is with Israel, and it is heavily guarded. In 2006, after the latest barrage of rocket attacks, Israel just decided to be done with it. They withdrew the settlers. They forcibly removed any Israeli people living within Gaza and said, fine, you can have it. And that's the point where Hamas won the elections to become leaders of Gaza, and they haven't had an election since. One man, one vote, one time. And in that time, have the people of Gaza built a functioning society? No. Has Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza, allowed them to come in? And no, they built their own wall. They don't want them. They get tons of foreign aid, but instead of using it to build electrical grids and running water and make sure everyone has enough food, they use it to build fortifications and weapons. All those rockets that keep getting launched. All those bombs they blow up. And that's why, even though I've moved away from my super pro-Israel position. I'm still, like I said, still generally pro-Israel. I can't quite get to the point of being pro-Gaza either, because they don't seem to want to have a country. All they care about is killing Israelis. And yet, not all, people who live in Gaza believe that, but I'm sure a lot do. I think I saw a poll the other day that said 90 to 95% of the people of Gaza support continued attacks on Israel. And again, that's because, from birth, they're taught to believe that this is their purpose in life. Imagine what they could do if they stopped doing that. If they just took all that foreign aid and instead of building missiles, built houses and apartments and electrical grids and running water. But instead, they don't. And so you see the suffering there, and they want you to believe that the suffering is due to Israel. For whatever reason, the people there are suffering, and it sucks. But what are you going to do? I mean, we can't go in there and force it on them, can we? That's what we tried in Iraq. That's what we tried in Afghanistan. It doesn't work. And there has to be a cultural change first. That said, the calls from some right-wing commentators over the last week to completely, kill every person in Gaza is way over the top. And I can't support, genocidal rhetoric like that, no matter who it's directed against. So that brings us to where we are today, where 2 weeks ago, terrorists from Gaza, from Hamas, invaded Israel, killed a bunch of people, and now Israel's preparing to invade Gaza. And I have no idea what's going to happen next. A lot of people who live there are going to die or be displaced, and that's going to look very bad on the cameras and be, shift world opinion once again against Israel. It's a mess. I keep saying that, but it is. However, one interesting thing over the last few weeks is to see how this conflict has spilled over into our country and into Europe. Now, this is one of many pictures we've seen over the past few weeks of pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian protests. And you see some of these signs are mass-produced. Some of them are just colored. That's nice. But others are they're printed and prepared for these protests. Party for Socialism and Liberation. These aren't some of the same guys behind Antifa and Black Lives Matter, are they? The people who show up at every protest wanting communism, militant communism. Same thing over here. This one, it's hard to read. Something socialist workers. And so some of the reaction against these protests on the right has been to say, well, to point out that, one, mass immigration brings this because a lot of these people are from the Middle East and they're bringing their ethnic, tribal rivalries and hatred with them. People are pointing out that this sort should not be in our country or in Europe. France is preparing to deport some of the people who are taking part in these protests, which, fine, more power to them. Why can't we deport the people who protest against our country? And that's where I want to focus here for the very end of this stream, is that you had this tweet from a pro-Palestinian person. I forget where she's from, but I think she's in a position of influence somewhere in our country. Said, "What did you all think decolonization meant? Vibes, papers, essays? Losers. Not like this. Then like what? Show us. LOL." So basically she's defending the terror attacks against Israelis, against innocent people, men, women, and children. She's defending it, saying that this is what decolonization is. Well, decolonization is this term that's been used by left-wing academics for a couple decades now to mean, they would say to get more people of color involved in discourse, to rely less on white authors like Shakespeare or white composers like Beethoven, to get rid of all those people and get different perspectives. I think that's what they might have said at one point, but now they're saying, oh, it literally means terrorism. It literally means killing men, women, and children who happen to be colonizers. And of course, they think you and I are colonizers. They think that basically any white person or any Christian, or as we can see, any Jewish person is a colonizer and should be murdered. And I think we need to take that threat seriously. I'm not saying pick up your guns and go do anything rash. I'm saying we need to rhetorically confront this. Unfortunately, a lot of propaganda, a lot of indoctrination, in school and media have made us afraid to stand up for our own culture and our own country. If you stand up for America, if you say you're America first, well, then you're a right-wing radical. You're a white supremacist. If you say that you believe America's a Christian nation, well, you're a Christian nationalist. Why should anyone listen to you? You're an extremist. That's what they say. And so we've been scared away from saying those things. We've been scared away from defending our own culture, our own country. And so we have to find another outlet for it, and I think that's where you get a lot of the right-wing support for Israel. Your basic right-wing conservative is afraid to say America first, but they have no problem saying Israel first, because it's expressing this nationalistic sentiment to protect one's own culture and one's own people in a way that the media has deemed safe. And I think we're seeing the same thing with stuff like this. They're saying, by any means necessary, and they're referring to the Palestinians against the Israelis, but they really mean it against us too. They really mean it against, the historic American nation. And again, I think we need to take that seriously. Kind of as a coda to this, consider the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. They've been fighting for a long time. They were both under the yoke of the USSR, and then once the Russian leadership was taken away, they started fighting each other. And you have essentially Azerbaijan is coming in and taking over this chunk of what was considered to be Armenia, and 120,000 Armenian Christians are being forcibly removed, or essentially they're leaving because they know what's coming. They're leaving because they know they're about to be persecuted. And remember, this is a people who faced genocide just over 100 years ago. The Armenian genocide is not talked about as much as I think it should be. 1 million Christians were wiped away by the Turks. And it gets forgotten in the historical discourse. And now we're seeing almost a replay of it. But where are the calls from American Christians to do something about this? These are fellow Christians who are being ethnically cleansed from a homeland that they've been in for thousands of years. Armenia is the first Christian nation in the world. It was the first kingdom back in the 2nd, 3rd century to officially adopt Christianity as its religion. So this is the oldest Christian nation in the whole world, and they're being targeted and ethnically cleansed by a neighbor. And that neighbor buys some of their weapons from Israel, which makes this a really complicated paradigm. But it's happening. And yet, American Christians, most have never heard of this because it doesn't make the news. And even if you've heard of it, a lot of people don't really give it much thought because we haven't been trained to feel an intense desire to protect fellow Christians in the world, the same way that we've been trained to want to protect Israel. And I'm not saying we shouldn't stand with Israel, but maybe we should stand with Armenian Christians too. Now, once again, this whole section of the world has seen war and conflict for hundreds, thousands of years. So a few things we need to keep in mind. One, we're not going to fix it overnight. I think President Trump actually did more than any president since perhaps Carter to bring peace there because he's a deal maker. He understands that you can't just take a binary good versus evil view of this, which unfortunately I think too many American conservatives have. The majority of my conservative friends support Israel and want to see Hamas wiped off the map, even if that means, eradicating 2 million people in Gaza. A minority of my conservative friends who are opposed to Israel, they would be happy with. I really can't speak for them, but I think they would support action against Israel in one way or the other. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here saying, well, what about America? How does this affect our country and our prospects for saving our country in the next 10, 20, 100 years? I don't want to see us get bogged down in another Middle Eastern war. I don't want to see us start World War III. The second thing is basically that. We need to decide how we respond, if we respond, and how much. We already give Israel billions of dollars in foreign aid every year. We give the Palestinians money. Biden just gave Iran money. Really, it was their money, but we had been holding on to it because we don't like dealing with sponsors of terrorism. So still, it's the same difference. We allow them access to this money. And I think that has to stop on all sides. We started doing it. We started passing out foreign aid in the Cold War because we were worried that countries that can't feed themselves fall to communism. Because if people can't eat, then they want to overthrow their government, and the communists come in and say, we have a better way, support us. And, it started with the Marshall Plan. And we started feeding these countries and giving them money, and then it moved to giving them money for weapons so that they could fight their enemies, who are really our enemies, because we're getting involved in these proxy wars, Vietnam style, against the Soviets. But by the end of the Cold War, we'd been doing it for so long that it's like our leaders forgot that we could just stop. Obviously, turning off the spigot in one go would probably cause some destabilization of the world, but there needs to be a way to de-escalate. There needs to be a way to start pulling back. We're $33 trillion in debt. Does it really make sense for us to be spending billions, hundreds of billions of dollars every year to try and play Risk on a global board? We dumped so much money into Ukraine because our leaders have this idea that killing Russians and degrading the Russian army is worth the money. Well, now that Israel's threatened, suddenly our leaders are saying, well, we don't have any more money for Ukraine because we're going to have to support Israel. And so where does that leave Ukraine? They've been hung out to dry. They've been thrown under the bus. I guess I can take that off now. And Russia's going to succeed with most of their war aims anyway. They're going to control Crimea. They're going to control the Donbass. That was inevitable from the start. A lot of people noticed it. But you had these people in our government who thought that it was worth the billions of dollars to just try and turn it into a meat grinder. But what do you say to the families of all the Ukrainians who are dead now because of that? It's like our leaders don't even care. What I want to see is an American conservative movement that is as enthusiastic for protecting America as they are for protecting Israel. We need to not be ashamed about saying that we can build a wall on our border, that we can spend money to protect our border, that maybe we can start looking into deporting people who are at least advocating for murder of Americans. If people go to a rally and say, hey, we're going to come in and kill white people, kill Christians, then why do we let them stay here? If we can deport them for saying, threatening the Jewish people in Israel, then we should be able to deport them for threatening, Americans. And that's really what we need. Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad on Twitter, he had a great tweet the other day that I retweeted. I'll see if I can put it in the show notes after I'm done with this live stream. And it was kind of a black pill, as the children say. He was talking about how the West has basically lost any, I phrase it as the courage of our convictions. We don't believe in ourselves anymore. We can't advocate for ourselves. We can't say that the American system that developed, from the vision of our, ancestors, from our founding fathers, and even before then, from the settlers who came here, we've lost the ability to say that it's a good thing and we can fight for it. Instead, we have to find proxies. We have to promote nationalism in Israel instead of here. We have to, if anybody's disparaging white people, for example, we have to find some conservative minority, Cassandra Owen or, Ben Carson, Michelle Malkin, to say it for us. When Michelle Malkin came here for a dinner a couple of years ago, she castigated us for it. She said, "Why are you, waiting for someone like me?" She's a Southeast Asian, a brown woman, as she would call herself. "Why are you waiting for someone like me to say these things, to defend, the American nation? You should be able to say these things." And I agree. We need to somehow recover that courage of our convictions. Otherwise, we're not going to last as a country any longer. We're going to fall either to, some group that does have the courage of their convictions. The Arabic historian Ibn Khaldun called it asabaya. It's this unity of purpose of young, small, ambitious tribes. Consider the Ottomans before they took Constantinople. They had that intangible thing that said, we are a great people, we are right, we, our God is behind us, and we are going to conquer. I'm not saying America has to conquer, but we did once have that. We did once have that asabaya. We expanded into the West. We said, this is our manifest destiny, to rule from sea to shining sea, to make it American. Just like Alexander made the known world Greek, we are going to make at least this part of the world American. And that being American means something. Whether you are a descendant of somebody who was here from before the revolution, or whether you recently came here, you had the same opportunity to make yourself American. But now, what does America stand for? Welfare? Murals of George Floyd in Kabul? The pride flag at our embassy in the Vatican City? What are we standing for? So either we're going to fall to some young tribe that has that asabaya, whether it's China or a united Arab world or whatever, or we're going to fall into a totalitarian technocracy where our individual rights are subsumed to this greater good collective. And the thing is, we can't fight either of those things unless we have that courage of our convictions, unless we believe in ourselves as Americans. And I don't see that. Anyway, Carl's tweet is really interesting. He goes into greater detail. He's very learned and well-read, so I'll link it below. But I do hope to see some sort of resurgence in America here in Idaho. I mean, we should take pride that so many people are moving here from failing states like California. We should have, you get a lot of the native Idahoans, the more establishment Republican types, who they look at these people coming from California and say, well, you got to be here a few generations before you're allowed to have a voice. Just go follow Brian Lenny on Twitter, and you'll see that. They deride him because he came from California a few years ago, and he has the audacity to run for office and to voice his opinions. But if we're to survive as a people, as a community, as a state, as a nation, then we're going to need that influx of people who believe in what we once believed in. I don't believe in the saying that America's just an idea. It's not. It's a people. However, if there is an idea to America, then we need to hold to it. And we need to promote it and shun those who oppose it. The very freedoms, the very freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of expression that once defined America as being something to be proud of were weaponized by a left that doesn't really believe in those things, but they'll happily use the fact that we do. And they promoted socialism and communism and relativism, and now they're promoting all sorts of awful things. So we need it's not enough to just say no to that. We need our own positive vision about what it means to be an American, what it means to be an Idahoan, and what we want our country to be in the next 50, 100 years. Otherwise, we're going to fall to people who have a stronger vision. And I think, again, we can debate the nature of Israel itself. We can debate, who to support over there, how much to support. I don't want to see us get involved in another war, but I definitely think we should stand with civilization against barbarians. However, I think this brings up questions about what it means to be an American and what it means to support America. And that's really what I want to see and what I hope that you've gotten from this. You look at all of the people who have conquered that strip of land in the last 2,000, 3,000 years. It's changed hands so many times. And yet we here in America, we've been pretty lucky to have stability. Ever since our country expanded westward, we've had about 200 years where our territorial our structure has remained intact. 200 years where we haven't had to worry about invasion. The closest we've ever come to being invaded was a Japanese submarine shelling the coast in World War II. We haven't faced a serious threat to our very existence as a nation, which obviously countries over there in the Middle East, including Israel, do every day. And maybe that's the sort of thing that might remind us of who we are, somehow restore the courage of our convictions. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope we're able to recapture that without facing an existential threat. But maybe that's what it would take. That's what Reagan said. If aliens landed, then suddenly the U.S. and the Soviet Union would suddenly find something more important than their conflict. So I don't know if it'll come to that. Hopefully it doesn't, and we can find it in ourselves. Anyway, hope this has been interesting. Hope this has been educational. Leave a comment below if you agree or disagree with anything I said. I'm just one guy. I don't know everything. I try to read history and put it together in a way that makes sense and gives context to the current day. So if you like what you saw, subscribe at gemstate.substack.com. You can even scan this site. Scan the QR code there. If you don't like what you saw, then leave a comment and tell me all about it. So I appreciate you watching.